today, the fact that our elites are working together to create a one world government is kind of the most obvious thing in the world. They just kind of announce it. They hold organized meetings about it to celebrate it, and kind of clap each other on the back for their efforts to create exactly that kind of organization. So it seems far from wild now, but one wonders why it was even smeared as wild then. I think we look at the way that the McCarthy era is treated and kind of the misnomers that swirl around kind of the state of America's relationship with communists inside of the country. You look that even guys like James Burnham were writing, I think it was A Web of Subversion is the book about communist infiltration. Mainstream guys who had access to the National Review were acknowledging this truth. So why was the fact that the Birchers were talking about being anti-communist, why did that stick out among the different conservative coalitions?
Well, early on, JBS found a lot of support with major conservatives. In fact, Robert Welch was friends with William Buckley. He actually helped him start National Review, gave him money to start National Review. And so, there was a lot of synergy there. But Robert Welch realized that what we were dealing with here was not just a communist conspiracy. Communist conspiracy was okay. You could say that, you could be in Congress and safely say, hey, there's a communist conspiracy. They're trying to infiltrate our institutions. But Welch eventually realized that this was even bigger than that. He realized that there was even a power behind the communist movement that really was diabolical in the truest sense of the word, with a plan to overthrow freedom and overthrow free societies. And there came a point where William Buckley, there's a lot of ideas about why he may have done this, but there came a point where William Buckley said, nope, that's too far. And so he actually used his magazine, National Review, to denounce the John Birch Society. First, Robert Welch, he specifically said, I'm not attacking the Birchers. They're nice people, great stuff. But their leader, Robert Welch, has got a problem. And, he argued that the JBS was too conspiratorial. As you pointed out, today we all see this, right, that there is a totalitarian effort to build a one world government. But if you go back to the 70s, that was not obvious. Welch did predict that as we got closer to the end stage of this, they would do the equivalent. What he said was the equivalent of running naked through the streets. And I think we're getting close to that phase now where, whereas what they once said, oh, you're being a kook. How dare you say there's a plan to create a world system? They would say, hey, why wouldn't you want a world system, right? If we don't have a world system, we're going to have chaos, we're going to have war, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we're in that stage. But William F. Buckley, I think if conservatives today knew all the facts about his record, they would be pretty concerned, right? William Buckley notoriously was a defender of the United Nations. The best thing you could say about the UN is that a waste of money for the dictators club. He was a proponent of what he described as a totalitarian bureaucracy within our shores to combat the alleged communist method. How you combat tyranny with tyranny, it's kind of like COVID, right? Doesn't really make sense. You can't comply your way out of it. And so all these things combined, and he went on this tirade and suggested that Robert Welch was basically going overboard. And one thing in particular that I think really set off Buckley and some of his allies was what started as a private letter. You can buy a copy of it today. I would encourage people to do it. It's called The Politician. Robert Welch essentially examined Eisenhower and said, we have a problem here, right? And he looked at a whole bunch of things. He looked at Operation Keelhaul, where Eisenhower led the effort to deport millions of Soviet refugees back to Joseph Stalin so that they could be murdered, tortured, butchered, etc. He basically handed Cuba to Fidel Castro on a silver platter. Now, once Castro announced that he was a communist, he said, wow, only a prophet could have predicted that Castro was a communist, because you had the New York Times saying he was a freedom fighter. You had Herbert Matthews, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, kind of deep state headquarters here, saying he was the George Washington of Latin America. But Robert Welch warned he's a communist. The U.S. ambassador to Havana, Earl Smith, said U.S. government stop supporting this guy. He's a communist. So the arguments against Eisenhower really drove Buckley and some of the other kind of establishment conservative gatekeepers crazy. But I want to add this here, Auron. A lot of people don't realize this. They say, well, Welch attacked Eisenhower. He was a war hero. Well, the only person to serve 2 terms in Eisenhower's administration, Secretary of Agriculture Ezra Taft Benson, agreed with Robert Welch. In fact, he said Welch is correct in his assessments of Eisenhower. He encouraged people to read that letter, and he ended up calling the John Birch Society the most effective non-church organization in the global fight against communist slavery. So there's a lot of facts that people don't know. If they did know, they'd be very alarmed. And today the spin masters have concocted a narrative out of thin air, right? Every once in a while you'll see, and I assume it's mostly ignorance, but every once in a while you'll see some neoconservative writer in the New York Times or the Washington Compost say that Welch was exiled from the conservative movement by Buckley over anti-Semitism or racism, something like that. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, while Welch was arguing against segregation, William Buckley was promoting segregation in the pages of his magazine. He had a whole article that he did in his magazine, National Review, that he called on Negro inferiority and white superiority, where he argued that blacks were inherently backwards and shouldn't be allowed to vote, and whites would be justified in using violence to prevent them to vote. So they've really distorted the history. Every once in a while, you hear the anti-Semitism smear, which totally silly. There actually have been Jews involved in the JBS, including at the leadership level, from the time of Welch's first meeting. But that gives you some of the kind of the context behind the attacks, the smears, and what the media likes today to call the purge of the extremists by the respectable gatekeepers like William Buckley.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like I said, it's almost never discussed in any real sense. It's just, well, Buckley got rid of the kooks, like the JBS. And usually if they bother to explain it at all, the explanation is, oh, well, they called Eisenhower a communist. They called him a communist agent, and that's why they were expelled. Did he actually end up accusing Eisenhower of being an agent of Soviet Russia?
He did not, actually. He gave this whole dissertation. Again, it started as a private letter that he circulated among friends, but once it became public, he published it as a book. But he lists all of these different things really troubling, right? Giving China to the communists, giving Cuba to the communists, deporting all the Soviet, expanding the size and scope of government. And he said there are several possible scenarios that could explain what's going on here. One of those scenarios, he said, was that Eisenhower was a dedicated agent of the communist conspiracy. Another was that he was being used and manipulated by communists. But ultimately, when you look at the role of Eisenhower in advancing the cause of communism, you have to seriously consider those scenarios and say, which one is the most likely to be true. And I would encourage people, before just relying on what you learned in your fake history textbook or what you heard on Wikipedia or the fake news about Eisenhower, go back and read the information that Welch compiled in this document. Again, today you can get it as a book called The Politician, and make up your own mind. And you tell me if you have an other explanation other than what Welch came up with, the different scenarios that could explain it. I would love to know it. Frankly, I don't know what was in Eisenhower's heart. I know he had a reputation as a war hero from World War II, but you have to explain these things. You have to explain Eisenhower's role in handing Eastern Europe to the communists, in handing refugees back to Stalin, in handing the most populated nation on earth to the communists. And, I think Americans are owed an explanation here. And if it was just innocent mistakes, okay, so be it, but let's see the evidence.
Hey guys, if you've been watching this show for a while, then you know that around here we encourage something that conservatives usually don't do. Winning. If you like what I'm doing here and you want to keep it going, then head over to Blaze TV. They have the behind-the-scenes content, exclusives, and documentaries that you're just not going to see anywhere else. So go to blazetv.com/Auron and subscribe today. The promo code is AURON, and you'll save $20 right now off the annual plan.